Sarah Chen never imagined that her morning jog through the mountains of Afghanistan would prepare her for the most challenging day of her military career. The 26-year-old Navy medic had been stationed at Forward Operating Base Titan for 8 months, treating everything from minor cuts to severe combat injuries. Her small frame and quiet demeanor often fooled people into thinking she was just another desk medic, but Sarah had trained harder than most of her male counterparts, and could carry a full combat load across 20 miles of rough terrain without breaking stride. The day started like any other Tuesday in the remote outpost. Sarah was organizing medical supplies in the aid station when the alarm pierced through the morning calm. Enemy contact had been reported in the valley below, where a SEAL team was conducting a reconnaissance mission. The radio crackled with urgent voices, but the transmission kept cutting out due to the mountainous terrain. What they could make out wasn't good. The team was pinned down, casualties were mounting, and their extraction point had been compromised. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, the base commander, gathered his senior staff in the operations center. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Satellite imagery showed the SEAL team trapped in a narrow canyon, with enemy fighters positioned on the high ground. The helicopter that was supposed to extract them had taken heavy fire and was forced to retreat. Storm clouds were rolling in from the west, making another air rescue attempt impossible for at least 6 hours. Sarah stood in the back of the room, listening to the heated discussion about rescue options. The infantry units were already engaged in other operations, and the quick reaction force was still 2 hours away from reaching the canyon. Every minute that passed meant the wounded SEALs were losing more blood, and their defensive position was becoming increasingly vulnerable. The enemy fighters were slowly closing in, using the rocky terrain to advance while staying hidden from view. The radio operator suddenly received a clearer transmission from the trapped team. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison, the team leader, reported that 3 of his 5 men were seriously wounded. One had taken shrapnel to the chest and was having trouble breathing. Another had been shot in the leg and couldn't walk. The third had suffered a head injury from a rocket explosion and was drifting in and out of consciousness. Morrison himself had minor injuries but was still able to fight, along with one other SEAL who was providing covering fire. Sarah felt her heart racing as she listened to the grim situation report. She had treated all of these men before. Rodriguez, the one with the chest wound, was only 22 years old and had just gotten engaged to his high school sweetheart. Thompson, with the leg injury, had 2 young kids at home and always carried their pictures in his helmet. Williams, the one with the head trauma, was known for his sense of humor and could make anyone laugh even in the darkest moments. These weren't just names on a casualty report. They were real people with families waiting for them to come home. The discussion in the operations center was going in circles. Every conventional rescue option seemed impossible or would take too long. The terrain was too rough for vehicles, the weather was getting worse, and the enemy had set up perfect ambush positions along all the obvious approach routes. Sarah watched the clock on the wall, knowing that each passing minute could mean the difference between life and death for the wounded men. That's when she remembered something from her advanced combat medic training. During a particularly challenging exercise in Nevada, her instructor had taught them about unconventional rescue techniques. Sometimes, he had said, the best way to reach casualties wasn't the most obvious way. Sometimes you had to think like the enemy wouldn't expect you to think. Sarah had always been good at finding alternative solutions to problems, a skill that had served her well in both her medical training and her previous job as a park ranger in Colorado. She studied the topographical map spread across the table, tracing possible routes with her finger. There was a steep ridge that ran parallel to the canyon, where the SEALs were trapped. The enemy fighters had positioned themselves to watch the main approaches, but they probably weren't expecting anyone to attempt the nearly vertical climb up the backside of the ridge. It would be dangerous and physically demanding, but it might be the only way to reach the wounded men before it was too late. Sarah cleared her throat and stepped forward. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to the young medic. She pointed to the map and outlined her plan. She would take the long way around, climbing up the backside of the ridge, under cover of darkness. From there, she could rappel down into the canyon behind the enemy positions. It would take her about 4 hours to reach the SEALs. But once there, she could provide immediate medical treatment and help coordinate their evacuation. The silence in the room was deafening. Several officers exchanged skeptical glances. Lieutenant Commander Webb rubbed his temples and looked at the map again. The plan was incredibly risky, and sending one person alone into enemy territory went against every military doctrine he had ever learned. But as he looked at the alternatives, he realized that Sarah's unconventional approach might be their only chance. Major Patterson, the operations officer, voiced what everyone was thinking. The climb would be treacherous even for an experienced mountaineer, and Sarah would have to carry all her medical equipment plus enough supplies to treat multiple casualties. She would be completely on her own, with no backup and no way to call for help if something went wrong. The enemy fighters were well-trained and heavily armed, and if they discovered her presence, she would be vastly outnumbered. Sarah listened to all the objections without flinching. She knew the risks better than anyone, but she also knew what would happen if they did nothing. The wounded SEALs would either bleed to death or be captured by enemy fighters who had no intention of following the Geneva Convention. She had taken an oath to preserve life, and she wasn't about to let 3 good men die because the mission seemed impossible. The debate continued for another 10 minutes, with voices rising as the pressure mounted. Finally, Lieutenant Commander Webb made the call. Sarah's plan was approved, but with modifications. She would have radio contact every hour, and if she missed even one check-in, they would assume she had been captured or killed and launch a full-scale rescue operation regardless of the risks. Sarah nodded and immediately began preparing for the mission. She selected her equipment carefully, knowing that every ounce would matter during the grueling climb. Medical supplies were her priority: bandages, morphine, blood-clotting agents, and emergency surgery tools. She also packed enough food and water for 2 days, just in case the extraction took longer than planned. Her rifle and ammunition came last, though she hoped she wouldn't need them. As she packed her gear, other members of the base came to offer support. Sergeant Martinez, the communications specialist, gave her an upgraded radio with extended range capabilities. Corporal Johnson, who had grown up rock climbing in Utah, shared tips about finding handholds in the dark. Even the cook, Private First Class Chang, contributed by preparing high-energy meals that would be easy to eat while moving. The storm clouds were getting thicker, and the first drops of rain began to fall as Sarah made her final preparations. She studied the map one more time, memorizing every contour line and landmark. The route would take her through some of the most challenging terrain in the region, but she had hiked similar mountains during her childhood in Colorado. Her father, a former Army Ranger, had taught her to read the landscape and find her way even when visibility was poor. As darkness fell, Sarah made her way to the perimeter of the base. The rain was coming down steadily now, which would help mask her movement but would also make the climb more dangerous. The rocks would be slippery, and the cold would sap her strength more quickly. She checked her equipment one final time and tested her radio connection with the operations center. Lieutenant Commander Webb came to see her off personally. He looked at the young medic with a mixture of admiration and concern. In all his years of military service, he had never asked someone to undertake such a dangerous solo mission. Sarah seemed remarkably calm for someone about to attempt what most people would consider impossible. She adjusted her pack, checked her weapon, and stepped into the darkness without looking back. The first hour of Sarah's journey took her across relatively flat ground, moving through scrub brush and rocky outcroppings. She used night vision goggles to navigate, but the rain was making everything more difficult. The equipment felt heavier with each step, and her boots kept slipping on the wet rocks. She had trained for conditions like this, but the reality was always more challenging than any exercise. As she approached the base of the ridge, Sarah could hear gunfire in the distance. The SEALs were still fighting, which meant they were still alive, but it also meant the enemy was getting closer to their position. She checked her watch and realized she was already 15 minutes behind schedule. The climb ahead would be the most difficult part of her journey, and she couldn't afford to waste any more time. The rock face loomed above her, disappearing into the darkness and rain. Sarah found a small ledge where she could reorganize her equipment and prepare for the vertical ascent. She switched from her heavy pack to a smaller climbing harness that would distribute the weight more evenly. Everything had to be secured properly because a dropped piece of equipment could either give away her position or leave her without critical medical supplies. She began the climb slowly, feeling for handholds in the darkness. The rock was limestone, which provided good grip when dry but became treacherous when wet. Sarah had to test each hold carefully before trusting her full weight to it. Her gloves became soaked within the first 50 feet, making it harder to maintain her grip. The cold was already starting to numb her fingers, and she was only a quarter of the way up the ridge. About halfway up the cliff face, Sarah encountered her first major obstacle. A section of loose rock blocked the most direct route, and she would have to traverse sideways along a narrow ledge to find another way up. The ledge was barely 6 inches wide, and one wrong step would send her tumbling down into the darkness. She pressed her body against the rock wall and moved inch by inch, testing each foothold before committing to it. The rain was getting heavier, and water was running down the rock face in small streams. Sarah's clothes were completely soaked, and she could feel the cold seeping into her muscles. She had to stop every few minutes to warm her hands and prevent them from cramping. The weight of her medical equipment seemed to double with each passing hour, but she refused to leave anything behind that might save a life. As she neared the top of the ridge, Sarah could hear voices below her. Enemy fighters were moving through the area, probably setting up new ambush positions or searching for alternative routes to the SEAL team's location. She pressed herself against the rock and remained perfectly still until the voices faded into the distance. Discovery at this point would not only end her mission but would also compromise the trapped SEAL's position. Sarah finally reached the top of the ridge just after midnight, 2 hours behind her planned schedule. She was exhausted, soaked, and shivering, but she had made it through the most dangerous part of her journey. From this vantage point, she could see the entire canyon where the SEALs were trapped. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as the firefight continued below, and she could see that the enemy fighters had indeed moved closer to the SEAL team's defensive position. She took a few minutes to rest and eat some of the high-energy food that Private Chang had prepared for her. The calories would help her body generate heat and give her the energy she needed for the descent into the canyon. Sarah also used this time to study the terrain below and plan her route down to the SEAL team's position. She could see several possible paths, but most of them would take her dangerously close to enemy positions. The descent would require rappelling techniques that Sarah had learned during her mountain rescue training in Colorado. She secured her rope to a sturdy boulder and tested the anchor point several times before trusting her life to it. The rock face on this side of the ridge was even steeper than the climb up, and she would have to control her descent carefully to avoid making noise that might alert the enemy fighters. Sarah began her descent slowly, using her feet to push off from the rock wall and control her speed. The rain made everything more difficult, and she had to stop frequently to clear water from her eyes and adjust her grip on the rope. About halfway down, she heard voices directly below her. A group of enemy fighters had taken position on a small ledge, probably to get a better view of the SEAL team's defensive position. She froze against the rock wall, hardly daring to breathe. The fighters were less than 50 feet below her, and any sound could give away her presence. Sarah waited for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes before the voices moved away. She continued her descent more cautiously, testing each movement to ensure she wasn't making any noise that could be heard over the sound of the rain and distant gunfire. When Sarah finally reached the bottom of the canyon, she found herself about 200 yards from where the SEAL team was positioned. She could see their muzzle flashes and hear their voices calling out target locations to each other. The enemy fighters had them surrounded on 3 sides, and it was only a matter of time before they would be overrun. Sarah knew she had to reach them quickly, but she also had to be careful not to get caught in the crossfire. She moved through the rocky terrain using every piece of cover available, crawling on her belly when necessary, to stay below the line of sight of enemy fighters. Her medical equipment made noise with every movement, and she had to constantly adjust her position to keep metal objects from clanking together. The rain was actually helping by masking small sounds, but it was also making it harder for her to see where she was going. As Sarah got closer to the SEAL team's position, she could hear Staff Sergeant Morrison coordinating their defense. His voice was calm and professional, but she could detect the strain underneath. They were running low on ammunition, and the wounded men were getting weaker. Rodriguez, the one with the chest wound, was having increasing difficulty breathing. Thompson's leg wound was bleeding more than it should, suggesting that a major blood vessel had been damaged. Williams, with the head injury, was no longer responding to questions coherently. Sarah finally reached a position where she could see the SEAL team's defensive perimeter. They had taken cover behind a cluster of large boulders that provided good protection from 3 directions, but left them vulnerable to attack from above. Morrison and Petty Officer Davis, the uninjured SEAL, were positioned to cover the most likely approaches, while the 3 wounded men were sheltered behind the largest rock. The challenge now was to make contact without getting shot by friendly fire. Sarah knew that the SEALs were on high alert and would shoot at anything that moved in the darkness. She needed to identify herself in a way that would be immediately recognizable but wouldn't alert enemy fighters to her presence. She remembered that Morrison had a distinctive whistle that he used to signal his team during training exercises. Sarah positioned herself where Morrison could see her if he looked in the right direction and used a small red-filtered flashlight to signal in Morse code. She flashed the message "Medic" 3 times, then waited for a response. After what seemed like an eternity, she saw Morrison signal back with his own light. He had spotted her and was acknowledging her presence, but he was also warning her about enemy positions between her location and their defensive perimeter. The next few minutes were crucial. Sarah had to cross 50 yards of open ground, while enemy fighters were actively searching the area. Morrison and Davis provided covering fire, but they had to be careful not to reveal their own positions by shooting too much. Sarah moved in short rushes, diving for cover behind rocks and in small depressions whenever she heard movement nearby. During one of these rushes, she came face to face with an enemy fighter who had been moving through the same area. Both of them were equally surprised, but Sarah reacted first. Years of combat training took over, and she neutralized the threat quickly and quietly. The encounter reminded her that she was deep in enemy territory, and that her medical mission could turn into a combat situation at any moment. Sarah finally reached the SEAL team's position just as the rain began to ease up. Morrison grabbed her arm and pulled her behind the protective boulder where the wounded men were waiting. In the dim light, she could see the extent of their injuries, and her heart sank. All 3 men were in worse condition than she had expected, and treating them would require more time and resources than she had originally planned. Rodriguez was barely conscious, and his breathing was becoming increasingly labored. The shrapnel in his chest had punctured his lung, and without immediate treatment, he would die within the hour. Thompson's leg wound was worse than initially reported. The bullet had shattered his femur and severed a major artery. He was going into shock from blood loss. Williams appeared to have a severe concussion and possible skull fracture. His pupils were unequal, and he was showing signs of increasing intracranial pressure. Sarah immediately went to work, starting with Rodriguez because his condition was the most life-threatening. She inserted a chest tube to re-expand his collapsed lung and administered morphine to manage his pain. The procedure had to be done by feel in the darkness, with only brief glimpses of red-filtered light to guide her hands. Every few seconds, she had to stop and take cover as enemy bullets ricocheted off the rocks around them. While she worked on Rodriguez, Morrison briefed her on their tactical situation. The enemy fighters had them completely surrounded, and their ammunition was running critically low. The storm had prevented any air support, and the quick reaction force was still at least an hour away. Even if Sarah could stabilize the wounded men, getting them out of the canyon alive would require a miracle. Sarah worked frantically to stabilize Thompson's leg wound while Morrison and Davis fought off another enemy advance. The bleeding was severe, and she knew that without proper surgical intervention, Thompson would lose his leg, even if he survived. She applied a tourniquet high on his thigh and packed the wound with clotting agents, but the damage to the bone meant that moving him would be extremely difficult. Williams was drifting in and out of consciousness, and Sarah could see signs that his brain injury was getting worse. His left pupil was becoming fixed and dilated, indicating increased pressure inside his skull. In a hospital, he would need immediate surgery to relieve the pressure, but in the field, her options were limited. She administered medication to reduce brain swelling and positioned his head to improve blood flow, but she knew these measures would only buy them time. As Sarah finished treating Williams, she heard Morrison curse under his breath. Davis had been hit in the shoulder during the last firefight, and now they were down to one fully functional fighter. Morrison himself was operating on adrenaline and determination, but Sarah could see that he was favoring his left side where shrapnel had cut through his body armor. The situation was becoming hopeless. and they all knew it. The enemy fighters were getting bolder, moving closer under cover of the rocky terrain. Sarah could hear them calling to each other in the darkness, coordinating their final assault. Morrison had maybe 30 rounds of ammunition left, and Davis could barely hold his rifle with his injured shoulder. The wounded men were in no condition to fight, and Sarah's primary weapon was a sidearm that would be useless in a prolonged firefight. That's when Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. Instead of waiting for the inevitable final assault, she would get the wounded men out of the canyon herself. The plan seemed impossible, but it was their only chance. She would carry each man one at a time to a secondary position further up the canyon, where Morrison could provide better covering fire, and where a helicopter might be able to extract them once the storm passed. Sarah explained her plan to Morrison, who initially rejected it as suicide. The secondary position was over 300 yards away, and the route would take them directly through areas controlled by enemy fighters. Even if Sarah could carry one of the wounded men that distance, she would never be able to make the trip 3 times without being discovered. Morrison argued that they should stay in their current position and fight until the quick reaction force arrived, but Sarah had studied the tactical situation carefully, and she knew that their current position was a death trap. The enemy fighters were already moving into positions where they could attack from above, and once they gained the high ground, the SEALs would be completely exposed. At least by moving, they would have a chance, even if it was a small one. Sarah had carried wounded soldiers during training exercises, and she knew she was stronger than she looked. The first casualty she chose to move was Rodriguez, whose chest injury made him the most vulnerable to further damage. Sarah fashioned a crude but effective carrying harness from medical tape and climbing rope, distributing his weight across her shoulders and back. Rodriguez was semi-conscious and could provide some assistance by holding on, but most of his weight would be on Sarah's frame. Morrison and Davis created a diversion by engaging enemy positions on the far side of their perimeter, while Sarah began her first rescue journey. She moved slowly and carefully, using every piece of available cover. Rodriguez was heavier than she had expected, and the uneven terrain made each step a challenge. Several times, she had to stop and rest, pressing herself against rocks while enemy fighters passed nearby. The most dangerous part of the route was a 50-yard stretch of open ground that couldn't be avoided. Sarah waited until Morrison and Davis launched another diversionary attack, then sprinted across the exposed area as fast as she could while carrying Rodriguez. Bullets kicked up dirt around her feet, but somehow she made it to cover without being hit. Her legs were shaking from the effort, and she was breathing hard, but Rodriguez was still alive, and his condition seemed stable. Sarah reached the secondary position after 45 minutes of careful movement. It was a natural cave formation that provided excellent protection from enemy fire and had multiple escape routes if needed. She made Rodriguez as comfortable as possible and checked his vital signs. The chest tube was still functioning properly, and his breathing had actually improved slightly during the move. The return trip to the original position was even more dangerous because Sarah was moving alone and the enemy fighters had adjusted their positions. She had to take a different route, crawling through areas where she could barely fit between the rocks. At one point, she found herself trapped between 2 enemy positions, unable to move in any direction without being spotted. She waited motionless for over an hour, until one of the groups moved away. When Sarah finally made it back to Morrison and Davis, she found them in an even more desperate situation. They had used most of their remaining ammunition during the diversionary attacks, and enemy fighters were now positioned less than 50 yards away on multiple sides. Thompson was going into deeper shock, and Williams had lost consciousness completely. Time was running out for all of them. Sarah immediately began preparing Thompson for transport. His leg injury made him much more difficult to carry than Rodriguez, and she had to improvise a splint system that would prevent further damage to his shattered femur. She used her climbing rope and medical supplies to create a full-body harness that would keep his leg immobilized during movement. Thompson was conscious enough to understand what was happening, and he tried to protest that he was too heavy for Sarah to carry. The second rescue trip was a nightmare. Thompson's weight was distributed differently than Rodriguez's, and Sarah found it much harder to maintain her balance on the rocky terrain. Halfway to the secondary position, her improvised harness began to fail, and she had to stop to make emergency repairs. While enemy fighters searched the area around them, Thompson was fighting to stay conscious and help as much as possible, but his injuries severely limited what he could do. Sarah's physical strength was being pushed beyond its limits. Her shoulders were cramping from the weight, and her legs were trembling with each step. She had been operating on adrenaline for hours, but now she could feel her body beginning to shut down. Still, she pressed on, knowing that Thompson would die if she couldn't get him to safety. The thought of his 2 young children waiting for their father to come home gave her the motivation to take one more step, then another. By the time Sarah reached the cave with Thompson, she was near collapse. Every muscle in her body was screaming in protest, and she was fighting waves of nausea from exhaustion. But Thompson was alive, and his condition had remained stable during the transport. Sarah quickly checked on Rodriguez, who was still breathing steadily, then forced herself to begin the return trip for Williams. The third journey back to Morrison and Davis was the most difficult yet. Sarah's body was operating purely on willpower, and she was making mistakes that could have gotten her killed. She stumbled several times, nearly giving away her position, and once she became disoriented and had to backtrack when she realized she was heading toward an enemy position instead of her destination. When Sarah arrived back at the original position, she found Morrison wounded and barely conscious. A grenade explosion had caught him in the open during another enemy advance, and he had shrapnel wounds in his back and legs. Davis was trying to tend to Morrison's injuries while also maintaining their defensive perimeter, but he was operating with one good arm and was running purely on determination. Williams was in critical condition. His brain injury had worsened during the time Sarah was away, and he was showing signs of severe neurological damage. Sarah knew that moving him might kill him, but leaving him would definitely result in his death. She made the hardest decision of her military career and began preparing Williams for transport, knowing that she might be carrying a dying man. The final rescue trip nearly broke Sarah completely. Williams was dead weight, unable to assist in any way, and his head injury required extremely careful handling to prevent further damage. Sarah had to move even more slowly and carefully than before, stopping frequently to check his vital signs and adjust his position. Her own injuries from the night's activities were beginning to affect her performance, and she was operating in a haze of exhaustion and pain. Halfway to the secondary position, Sarah heard the sound she had been praying for all night: helicopter rotors in the distance. The storm had finally cleared enough for air support to reach them. She used her radio to guide the helicopter to the secondary position, where Morrison and Davis were making their way with the last of their strength. The extraction was chaotic but successful. All 6 members of the team were pulled from the canyon, just as enemy fighters launched their final assault on the now empty defensive position. Rodriguez, Thompson, and Williams were immediately flown to the military hospital in Germany, where surgeons worked to save their lives and limbs. Morrison and Davis required surgery for their wounds but were expected to make full recoveries. Sarah herself spent 3 days in the hospital being treated for exhaustion, dehydration, and multiple injuries sustained during her rescue mission. When she was finally released, she learned that all 3 of the men she had carried to safety would survive. Rodriguez would return to full duty after recovering from his chest injuries. Thompson would keep his leg and eventually return to active service. Williams faced a longer recovery from his brain injury but was expected to regain most of his cognitive function. The story of Sarah's heroic rescue spread throughout the military community and eventually reached the public. She was awarded the Silver Star for her actions, becoming one of the few women to receive such a high military honor. But for Sarah, the real reward was seeing Rodriguez, Thompson, and Williams return to their families alive. Years later, when people asked Sarah about that night in the canyon, she would always say that she was just doing her job. She had taken an oath to preserve life, and she had simply honored that commitment under difficult circumstances. But those who served with her knew that what Sarah Chen accomplished that night went far beyond duty or training. She had carried 3 men to safety when everyone thought she was down, proving that true heroism isn't measured by size or strength, but by the courage to act when action seems impossible.